All right, part 5 of social psychology, the last part with Professor Gerding. So we last left with the question, how many participants do you think took Stanley Milgram's experiment all the way to 450 volts? Not how many do you think just stopped, but how many do you think took it all the way? Not how many stopped after the learner stopped responding, but how many kept on going until they couldn't go any further? The answer to that question is, I'm skipping ahead here, 65%. What? 65%. Let's go back a slide so you can see this picture. Here's this gentleman getting strapped in to this chair, and that is what participants witnessed happening, and over 65% took it all the way to the end. Even those that protested. So a lot of people didn't believe this when it came out. People thought, that can't be right. Your numbers are wrong, whatever. But why did Stanley Milgram do this experiment on obedience? It's because of World War II. What? Why World War II? Think of the Nazis and the concentration camps. And I want you to realize how many Nazis were actually put to death because of all of the people that they killed, considered crimes against humanity. But when they were asked on court, hey, why did you murder systematically so many people? Their answers? I was just following orders. And over 65% of the participants in this study were not facing death themselves. Stanley Milgram was not holding a gun to them. Stanley Milgram wasn't going to accuse them of being a traitor or going against a superior's orders if they said no. It was just this unwritten social obligation that kept people going on. So the question is, should we have killed these individuals, or are Nazis any different than anyone else? And that's a really uncomfortable question, because people were really upset at Stanley Milgram with this experiment. They said, are you suggesting that we're all Nazis? In fact, some people actually said this: who were your participants in this experiment? Certainly your participants must have just been Germans, because people believed Germans were genetically bad. They called it the evil seed Germans. And Stanley Milgram showed, no, it's all sorts of people, the 65%. So the interesting thing is that people then responded with, well, maybe people are innately evil then, just like Nazis. If we're no different than the Nazis, everyone's evil. But are we? Because if we were evil, when we witness people doing this experiment, participating in it, they'd probably be laughing. The gentleman would scream like, ah, and they'd be loving it. Ha 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 ha, we're hurting someone else. But people were upset, really upset about this experiment. The people participating in it, some people were actually crying. Some people were screaming at Stanley Milgram, he's dying in there. What are you doing? We gotta let him out, he's dying. You must continue. You hear that? He's dying. I can't believe, But they keep on going. It's this really interesting experiment. And we have repeated it since then. We can't repeat it now. Not without a lot of clarification through our internal review board, the IRB. Why? Because most people, 80% said, what an amazing experiment. Those that participated, 80% said, this is an amazing experiment. But just 2% were really upset. Why were they so upset? Because imagine you thoroughly believed that you had just ended up murdering someone. Well, that is what they thought. They walked away thinking, I murdered someone. So that is why they were so upset. This experiment has been repeated over and over again and again and again, but not so much in America and other countries. And do you think that 65% is any different nowadays? The answer is no. It's just stronger. So this is Stanley Milgram's experiment on obedience. So over 65% went all the way to the end. Now that we talked about Stanley Milgram, let's just end this chapter with a question on deindividuation. I'm going to ask you another question, as I so like doing. Let me ask, would you ever join in on a riot? Like, I want you to think, is it okay to steal? Is it okay to throw things through a window and steal, even if you don't even know the reason? Well, this is deindividuation. I like to call it the mob effect, but deindividuation is the fact that people lose their awareness of their own individuality when they're in large group or crowds. You may think, I would never storm Castle Frankenstein, but when you see everyone in the village saying, grab your torch, we're gonna kill us a monster, you're thinking, yeah, and you jump on in. In fact, let me end with this story, a true story about my good friend Michael Ferrone. I would love to tell you so much about Michael Ferrone, but long story short, he's one of the most moral individuals you'll ever meet. He went into law school not because he wanted to make money or anything like that, but ever since I've known him, he's always wanted to fight for the little guy. He always was so against bullying, either through legally, through schools, any type of bullying you can think of. He was totally against it, and he wanted to get the education to back that up. So here's this very moral individual, and he's studying for his upcoming test, and he hears a ruckus outside. And he opens up the door into the streets, and what he sees is a whole bunch of people flipping over cars, looting, breaking windows. Horrible things, in his opinion. But the amazing thing was, so many people were doing it, he described the feeling that overcame him. It filled him up like water filling a glass of excitement. In fact, he actually caught himself muttering, yes, yes. He got this adrenaline, this real excitement, and he knew he was going to join in with flipping over some cars. Hey, breaking some windows sounds amazing. But before he got the chance, he got hit with tear gas. And the interesting thing is, when Mike Ferrone tells his story, he thanks the tear gas because he knew he was going to join in, but he didn't. He totally lost his individual self, like a wolf howling at the moon. He no longer knew who he was. He was going to dive into the wild, but he didn't. And that's deindividuation. These are really important things to understand. All of these topics that we discussed. Stanley Milgram, Kitty Genovese, Salman Ash, Zimbardo. Because keep in mind, you need to know who you are and realize no matter which situation you're in, no matter how many people are around, you still have the mental ability and the right to say no or take the time to think about it. As uncomfortable as it may seem, take the step back, take the breath, and remember Stanley Milgram's experiment on obedience. Remember how no one helped Kitty Genovese. Remember how so many people conformed to Salman Ash. Remember that these mentally healthy college students started doing horrific things just because of what they thought it meant to be a prisoner or, more importantly, a guard. And remember Sharif's experiment, that just because someone is different than you, even if it's just they're on the other side of a physical line, a literal line, they're on one side, you're on the other, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's real differences or that's justification for hate, stereotypes, prejudice, etc. So anyways, I know that sounded a little preachy, but research shows that we do some crazy things when we're in bigger groups. So I'm your professor, Professor Gerding, and I hope you enjoyed Chapter 12. Keep this in mind for the upcoming test, and a lot of what I told you is radically different than what's in your text. Your text has most of these things. They're presented differently. I hope you enjoyed it. If you made it all the way through parts 1 through 5, thanks a lot. And don't be a stranger. If you have any questions, don't forget to email me. I'll answer them. It's part of my job. Take care.